Buenos días a todos. Bienvenidos al Observatorio de la Lengua Española y las Culturas Hispánicas en los Estados Unidos, un observatorio del Instituto Cervantes en la Universidad de Harvard. El Instituto Cervantes, como probablemente sepan, es una institución española dedicada a la difusión y al estudio de la lengua española y de las culturas hispánicas por todo el mundo. En este momento el Instituto Cervantes dispone de una red de casi 90 centros en 44 países y estos centros se dedican fundamentalmente a enseñar español, a difundir la cultura y el pensamiento en español por medio de exposiciones, conciertos, biblioteca y todo tipo de actividades culturales, y también con programas de formación de profesores. Entre otras cosas, el Instituto Cervantes es la institución encargada de preparar los diplomas de español como lengua extranjera oficiales del Ministerio de Educación de España. Pero en Harvard, en Boston, el Instituto Cervantes no se dedica a enseñar español ni a ofrecer una biblioteca teniendo tan cerca una biblioteca como la Widener, sino que nos dedicamos a observar, por eso nos llamamos observatorio, lo que ocurre con el español y con los latinos en Estados Unidos, para después analizarlo, debatirlo y publicarlo, divulgarlo por medio de unos informes como los que acaban de ver aquí en la entrada y que están a su disposición, que pueden llevarse y que en cualquier caso también pueden consultar en línea, puesto que son de acceso libre y gratuito para todos ustedes a través de la página, del portal del observatorio. Don't be afraid if you don't speak Spanish, because this event is in English. So, this event today is a conversation. It's a conversation in the Observatorio, a conversation about linguistic and cultural resilience with a presentation by María Carreira. So I want to thank María Carreira, Professor Carreira, for being here today. I want to thank you all for coming up to this observatory facilities. And I am delighted to express my deeper gratitude to María Luisa Parra. She will do the introduction and she will do the honors in this event. And now please join me to welcome María Carreira and María Luisa Parra.
Bueno, buenos días and good morning to everybody. And I also want to thank Professor Francisco Moreno Fernandez for providing us, not only me, but other faculty with this space to promote very fine and cutting-edge scholarship that Carreira is going to present today. And this event is co-sponsored by the Observatorio de la Lengua Española, what they call Conversaciones, and also with a seminar, about this. Es la enseñanza del español como lengua de herencia, teoría y práctica that I have been putting together. This is the third gathering, and we also like to, give these public lectures to invite experts in the field. So today is my great pleasure to introduce Professor María Carreira. She's Professor of Spanish at the California State University, Long Beach. María Carreira's research focuses on heritage languages with a concentration in Spanish in the U.S., as well as the less commonly taught languages. Her recent work focuses on identity, resiliency, and heritage language development and maintenance. She's also co-director of the National Heritage Language Research Center at UCLA. I said it right.
Yes, very good.
And she's also the chair of the SAT Spanish Committee and associate editor of Hispania. I'm sure that all of you are familiar with some of the publications she has done in the past, including the textbook Nexos and other publications like Spanish in the United States, the Polyglot Boarding House, Languages in the United States, co-author with Kim Potosky, and also the results of the National Heritage Language Survey, Implications for Teaching, Curriculum Design, and Professional Development. That was published in the Foreign Language Annals, co-author with Ola. So, join me in welcoming Professor María.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to start out, of course, with the most important thing. thanking the people in the center that made this possible, María Luisa Parra, Francisco Moreno Fernandez, y el Instituto Cervantes for the great work that they're doing. As the title of my presentation shows, I'm going to be telling stories today. I hope wonderful stories that you'll enjoy hearing, and stories that will fill you with hope, because that's what these stories do for me. The focus of this presentation is the concept of resilience. How many of you are familiar with the concept of resilience? There's a lot of talk, actually. You turn on the TV and it's almost, you hear a lot of talk about resilience. But I want to focus in particular on the relationship between resilience and heritage language, culture, and heritage language maintenance, and the role that resilience can play in heritage language education, and more generally in the education and the socialization of Latino students. A little bit of terminology. I have a feeling it's not needed, but never know. A heritage language is a language of family relevance. It can be an immigrant. Most of the time it's used in relation to immigrant languages, but it can also be an indigenous language. A heritage language learner is a student who studies that language. A heritage language speaker is a person who speaks the language. And heritage language education is the field of education of pedagogy that focuses on teaching heritage languages to heritage language learners. So I'm going to be referring to these terms a lot throughout this presentation. The stories I'm going to tell come from a book that I just published that I'm very happy about, and I will be reading from them. So this is the book where I collected hundreds, I interviewed hundreds and hundreds of students, some families too, by way of answering the question, what's it like to live as a Latino in the U.S.? It's an important question because I realized a few years ago when I first started working on this book, the impetus for this book was my realization at some point that I had no idea what it was like. You know, I'm a Latino woman. I came here as a child. You think I would know. But really talking to my students, I realized that there are many other realities out there that I was not aware of, and I wanted to explore those realities. So I started talking to young people. I spread the word among colleagues that I wanted to interview young people. I also interviewed their families. I started looking through the literature. There's a lot of literature, but by literature I mean actual literature, poems and stories and novels written by U.S. Latinos that gives us a lot of insight into what this population goes through. And what I want to focus on today is the potential of this population. So I want to start with an interview of a young man that is a heritage speaker of Spanish. If somebody could, because I'm not bilingual when it comes to math, to PCs.
I just want to take this opportunity
Yes.
just to say that we're going to go for about 45 minutes
Okay.
for the presentation. We're going to have a break, and then we can open up the floor for discussion, questions for half an hour or something
Sure.
like that, because I'm sure that there will be a lot of questions and comments.
It's coming.
Okay, perfect.
My name is Arturo Diaz, and I was born in East Los Angeles. My mother is Cuban, and my father is Mexican. I grew up in a household where we pretty much spoke Spanish from childhood. I was raised mainly with my grandmother as well, and I actually thank my grandmother for keeping Spanish alive with me because she didn't speak a word of English, and so I always had to speak Spanish with her if I wanted to eat. And that's what I tell everyone. If I wanted to eat, I needed to speak Spanish to her. I grew up with my grandmother, and we did a lot of errands together. I always had to translate for her. So wherever we would go, a supermarket, bank, or whatnot, I was maybe just like 6 years old, and you know, in retrospect, I was already a translator back when I was 6 years old. And then, when my grandmother passed away, and that was also around college, that's where Spanish really took a big turn for me, because it was always a connection with my roots. And my grandmother sort of forced me to always be in touch with my roots. And when I lost her, I almost stopped speaking Spanish because my mother would she got used to just speaking English with me. And then all of a sudden, I was the one who like changed. I said, no, my roots are Spanish. Well, actually, my roots are Cuban. My father passed away when I was 11 years old. And so I don't know much about the Mexican part of my family, but I know I've always been exposed to the Cuban part. And so that I associate myself with a Cuban descent. And so I started to speak Spanish to my mother all the time, and I still do. I never speak English to her. I always just speak Spanish because it is my connection to my roots. And for me, Spanish, it's not just, it is me. It is my identity. Who am I? What am I? I'm an American, that's true, but I can't negate my Cuban roots. And it's gotten to the point that English for me, it comes out so fluently for me because I was educated completely in English, never had any formal training in Spanish. But it almost hurts that English is so dominant in my life, and I'm so good at it, and I don't have that same facility with Spanish. Now, of course, I've never, like I said, I haven't been trained for, I have no formal instruction in Spanish, but that doesn't mean I can't read or write. But I took it upon myself. I remember when I was, even when I was young, I would look at the magazines that my grandmother would read, and they were always in Spanish. And I would just start looking through them, and by then I already spoke English. I could read English. So, you know, it was just one small step to start reading Spanish. I mean, it's pretty much through the Latin alphabet. So I think I taught myself how to read Spanish. And in terms of writing, I've never actually had much formal training in it, but I can write Spanish.
Thank you. So you can see in Arturo's little interview, the small part of the total interview I did with him, is that the agency, the sense of agency, he understands the role that Spanish and Latino culture has in his life. And there are other parts I cut out, but he forces his mother to speak Spanish. In this interview, he talks about how his mother always spoke English to him until at some point he said to her, no, we are bringing back Spanish into the household. So the sense of agency, the sense of understanding of who he is and what he's about, and what he needs to develop in order to fulfill himself as a human being, and also the incredible ability that he displays as a student to teach himself how to read and write in Spanish. These are all elements of resilience, and I'm going to be coming back to them throughout this presentation. So let's start out by looking at what resilience is. There's an element of positive adaptation to an adverse situation. So you need to have some kind of adverse situation and then some positive adaptation or response. There are many definitions out there of resilience. Here's a particularly well-known one: the capacity to tap into personal, cultural, and social resources for maintaining well-being and finding meaning under difficult situations. So the key here is capacity, which is an individual thing, and opportunity, which is an outside, an environmental thing from the outside, and of course the resources, which are also an outside thing. But it's not rare. Actually, resilience is found in many people. It's not a fixed personality trait. Anybody can develop resilience. That's not to say we can all develop it to the same degree. Some people have more of a capacity to develop resilience, but absolutely everybody can develop resilience. And it's best conceived as a process of connecting with resources that promote well-being or protective factors. Let me just give you a very brief history of resilience. Earlier approaches to studying at-risk populations, this is a label that's frequently applied to Latino students, right? At-risk students. Such studies focus on risk factors. And that perspective was based on the assumption that individuals exposed to those risk factors would have adverse outcomes. It was just predetermined that they would have adverse outcomes. And then the individuals who didn't exhibit adverse outcomes were seen as an anomaly. Something strange, statistical noise was the word that was applied to them. So the remedies resulting from this perspective on adversity was that we viewed at-risk populations as something to be controlled, and by eliminating to the extent possible the risk factors and having some kind of intervention when adversity struck. As research continued to unfold, studies started to show that surprisingly high numbers of at-risk children actually develop into competent, confident, I think, and caring adults. In this study that I cite, 30% of children that were studied in Hawaii actually developed into competent, confident, and caring adults. So this resulted in a shift in perspective from seeing the victims of adversity as subjects to be controlled to seeing them as critical resources for attaining positive outcomes for at-risk populations. What distinguished these individuals? Well, two factors, or two types of factors: intrinsic factors and extrinsic factors. In the category of intrinsic factors, there were issues having to do with personality, factors related to individual personality, intelligence, and talent. For example, students or young people who were very talented, who had a particular gift, for instance, a musical gift, or who were very charming, or who were highly intelligent, related better to others, and as such received more attention, had access to more opportunities, etc. In the area of extrinsic factors, two things came up. The quality of a child's relationship, so a caring family came up as particularly important. Supportive relationship with adults like teachers, school administrators, counselors, etc. And ecological factors, in particular quality schools and safe neighborhoods. And I'm going to go back at the end, near the end of this presentation, and there are three of those things that I want to focus on. The notion of talent, how talent can boost a person's resilience, supportive relationships, and quality school. So remember, I'm coming back to that near the end. Competencies associated with resilience are problem solving, social competence, autonomy. You see it in Arturo, the autonomy, the agency, the sense of purpose that he says, I took it upon myself to speak Spanish and to learn how to read and write Spanish. The American Psychological Association's Task Force on Resilience and Strength in Black Children calls it the competency, the ability to resist racial prejudice and defy negative societal expectations. Many studies have been done on specific at-risk populations, for example, homeless children, transgender youth, children of the Great Depression, pregnant adolescents. There have been also studies of minority children, and I want to focus in particular on the first one, studies of successful Latino and African American students. This is a study that was done in 1994, and at the bottom I have highlighted in red the most important factors, which were to trust accommodation without assimilation. By that, he means that they were able to succeed in American culture without leaving their Latino selves, without leaving their cultural selves. So they were able to maintain dual identities. Successful Latino and African American children were able to maintain dual identities, achieving academically while affirming their cultural identity. This student also pointed to the importance of cultural values, family bonds, community and family support, and supportive school programs. Of course, I'll be coming back to all of that. So why should we, as HL teachers, and actually as teachers in general, or individuals in this society in general, concern ourselves with resilience? Several reasons. First of all, because HL-speaking children, Latino children in particular, experience exposure to risk or adversity. So there's that part of the equation. Remember, resilience has to do with adversity and positive adaptation, right? These young people experience a great deal of adversity. Adversity comes in two forms: non-linguistic forms stemming from issues like poverty, discrimination, the stresses of immigration, which come with family separation, in some cases lack of legal status. So there's that kind of stress. And then there are linguistic risk factors, which I'm going to call living under the shadow of two languages. I'll come back, and that's what I'm going to focus on mostly. I'm also going to give you some non-linguistic factors, or discuss some non-linguistic factors, but it's mostly the living under the shadow of two languages that I'm going to talk about here in the context of describing the resilience of these young people. Before I do that, I want to ask a question. I want to go back again to the point why we should concern ourselves. Well, probably the best argument is the demographic one. 1 out of every 5 children, 22% in American schools, speaks a language other than English at home. This number is significantly higher in some of the nation's largest urban areas. You can see there, Chicago, 41%. Los Angeles, 65%. Can you imagine? LA Unified is 65% Latino. Houston, 55%. New York, 49%. In terms of U.S. Latinos in particular, 24.7% of all elementary school children are Latino, 21% at the secondary level, and 16% of college students. The Pew Center is well aware of this and summarizes the significance of this in this wonderful quote: between 2000 and 2025, the white working age population will decline by 5 million as baby boomers retire from the labor force. Working age Latinos are projected to increase by 18 million. Thus, the vitality of the U.S. workforce increasingly depends on Hispanic educational progress. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to give you a lot of positive information. I don't mean to gloss over all the negatives or to deny the negatives. They're there. So let me put them out. I'm sure you're aware of them. As a matter of fact, I think we're mostly aware of those negative labels, all the problems that Latino face. They're real, and they're something we need to contend with as a nation. But the point I want to leave you with is that there's much more to this story than just the negatives, which are true. There's another side to the story, and that is a wonderful side. So it's first the negatives, okay? 46 is the percentage of Latinos who attend elementary school in a high poverty area. And we know high poverty has very negative outcomes from the point of view of education and social development. So that's a serious issue we need to contend with. 75% of Latino youth are high school graduates. Compare that to 90% Asian, 88% white, and 81% blacks. So Latinos are not graduating from high school at the same rate as other populations. And 13% of young Latinos have a bachelor's degree. Compare that to 53% of young Asians, 39% of young whites, and 19% of young blacks. So definitely we have an education, a Latino academic gap is what I call it. An education issue. We have issues that we need to address in the area of education, because the future of these students will determine the future of the country, right? So, and there it is. The future of this nation is inextricably linked to that of U.S. Latinos and other language minority children. So we need to pay attention to what's happening with these children. With this in mind, I want to go back to the linguistic risk factors. That's what I want to focus on today. This notion of living under the shadow of two languages. First, I want to tell you where this term came from. I didn't make it up. It's a wonderful term. Rosina Lippi Green has a wonderful book about discrimination against people with accents. And it's not just about immigrants. For instance, she talks about discrimination against Southerners. If you think about it, in movies, whenever there's a stupid person, they give that person a Southern accent, right? And she talks about how linguistic discrimination is one of the last types of discrimination that are okay in society. And this is what she calls the shadow of language. She says, as a speaker of a variety of U.S. English, which is not stigmatized, on occasion I feel inferior about my own language. But because I belong to the social and hence to the language mainstream, which isolates me from the process of subordination, any feelings of inferiority are entirely my own making. Other value systems are not forced on me. I am allowed the consolation of my mother tongue. I am free of the shadow of language. and subject only to the standards that I accept for myself. So there's the term, right? What I want to show you today is that language minority children live under the shadow of not one, but two languages. So it's much harder, right? So let me just quickly review the dimensions of resilience, the risk factors, and positive adaptation, right? I'm going to show you four risk factors, but I'm going to show them in pairs because they're mirror images of each other. So the factors are the burdens of living under the shadow of two languages. And I'm going to show you some very interesting adaptation strategies that Latino students use to deal with this living under the shadow of two languages. So again, a review, here are some strategies of positive adaptation that research connects with the notion of resilience. Problem solving, which involves being resourceful, being insightful. You can see that in Arturo, in having critical consciousness. Social competence, which involves being able to use cross-cultural communication skills. Empathy, forgiveness. Autonomy, which involves having a positive identity. Self-efficacy or agency, right? And adaptive distancing. Adapting distances is about saying, this isn't my problem. I may be hearing all sorts of things about my people, but it really isn't about me. It's about the people who are coming up with all these negative things. In sense of purpose, which is optimism, goal direction. Resilience is a sense of resistance and defiance. Resilient people defy what they're told. They don't accept everything that's given to them. So they don't accept prejudice as something that's internally their problem. So the risk, I'm going to start with two risk factors. Remember, I'm going to give you four, but I'm going to present them in twos because they're really mirror images of each other. It's quite interesting. So one of these burdens that Latino face is the burden of being seen as un-American or antisocial or unintelligent for speaking Spanish. The flip side of that is they're seen as un-Latino, antisocial, or unintelligent for not speaking Spanish. Wow, talk about being in a bind, right? Let's look at some narratives from the book. In the blue, I have the adaptive strategy. So the black is the risk factor, the blue is the adaptive strategy. This one is the burden of being seen as un-American, antisocial, or unintelligent for speaking Spanish. So, whoops, I was only one of 20 Hispanics in my high school. When my best friend and I would speak Spanish, the non-Spanish speakers would look at us with anger. One day, a fellow classmate interrupted a conversation and said, "Will you please stop talking about us? Why don't you speak English and leave Spanish for the other Mexicans in Mexico?" Here's the adaptive reaction. I got really offended and responded, first of all, Mexicans are not the only ones that speak Spanish. Second, I'm not Mexican, I'm from Honduras. And third, what makes you think I'm talking about you? I'm not even looking at you. So please turn around and mind your own business. How is that for resilience, right? We see defiance. The student doesn't shrink, right? We see adaptive distancing. Hey, it's your problem. You don't even know anything about Spanish, who speaks it and who doesn't. In critical consciousness, where is this student coming from? She's wrong. These are strategies of resilience. Here is a narrative that depicts the burden of being seen as un-Latino, antisocial, or unintelligent for not speaking Spanish. So this is the flip side, right? When I was little, I didn't know Spanish, but many people thought I did because of my looks. Kids would come up to me and start speaking Spanish, and I would just look at them and say, "Sorry, I don't speak Spanish." Then they would look at me with this disgusting facial expression that would crumble any person to lost pieces of identity. Here's the adaptive distance. I push myself hard to learn the language, and though I don't speak it as well as I'd like to, I can now hold my own in Spanish. So how is that for problem solving and self-efficacy? This is a student with agency. He didn't just crumble into 1,000 pieces. He responded in a very proactive and positive way. I'm going to shift now to the two other burdens. The burden of never being good enough in Spanish or English, because it's two languages, right? And then the flip side of that, the burden of being good enough in Spanish or English. So let me start with the first burden, the burden of never being good enough in Spanish. Every year, my family and I go to Mexico to visit our relatives. It's a great experience, but some people have problems with the norteños, northerners. Sometimes when I'm with my cousins and her friends and I say a wrong word, they laugh at me. Now here comes resilience. I don't get angry. I just ask them how to say it correctly. But I have seen other people react very differently. They get angry and snap at those who make fun of them. This gives Mexican the impression that Mexican Americans are cranky, arrogant, or that they don't care about their roots. That may be the case about some of us, but it's not right to make fun of us because we make mistakes. So this student has enormous social competence. Instead of snapping at his critics, he says, teach me how to do it. Critical consciousness of what's happening and insights as to what is happening. This is amazing for a young person, if you think about it. I'm not sure that at this age I would be able to do this. Let's go to the flip side of that, the burden of being good enough in Spanish or English. A large portion of the paperwork my father had to fill out to refinance the house was too complicated for him to understand, since his ability to read English is very limited. I remember attempting to read the paperwork, and there were many words that I could not understand myself since I was only 11 years old. I remember my father getting frustrated and angry at me, telling me that since I knew English and had been studying it in school for a couple of years, I should be able to comprehend what was written and translated. Here's resilience. I had to explain to my father that I was just a child and that I had a lot to learn. That's amazing. You know, how level-headed and how mature this student is, right? Strategies of resilience at work, self-awareness, empathy, and caring for his father. The number of the stories I got about people saying, I feel so sorry for my parents. It was not their fault. They put me in these very difficult translation experiences. It's not something that they could help. They needed me. They did the best they could. And also the ability to manage strong impulses and feelings. You can imagine how frustrated this kid would want to run away or scream at an adult. He doesn't. He simply resorts to giving a very good explanation. So depicted in these stories is resilience underlying, at the bottom, sustaining three processes that specialists in HL languages are very interested in. And they are reversing language shift, maintaining the heritage language and heritage language culture, and resisting language shift. Language shift is what happens to almost every immigrant that has come to the United States. Eventually, over the course typically of 3 generations, they shift to English, abandoning the immigrant language. Reversing language shift is what some of our students talk about. I've already read about it. These students who say, I've lost Spanish, but I'm going to regain Spanish. Maintaining language involves keeping it going from one generation to the other. But the point I want to make is that these strategies of resilience are underlying each of those processes that we've seen in the narratives I presented. Now, the field of heritage language studies has elements, things that remind us or make us think of resilience. For example, there's a field of an area of publication that's called critical language awareness, where people talk about teaching students about, in the HL class, teaching students about issues like linguistic discrimination, raising linguistic critical consciousness of issues of bilingualism, developing a positive linguistic identity, resisting linguistic discrimination. All of these things have been presented within this area of critical language awareness. They've not been connected to the larger issue, the larger framework that I'm presenting today, which is the framework of resilience theory. There's also one article that mentions the word biliteracy. It's by Lucy Che. And she studied biliterate children, Chinese biliterate children, and found that the conditions listed there support literacy in the HL: parental, institutional, and peer support. What does that sound like? Positive strategies of resilience, right? A social identity that is inclusive of the heritage language and culture, and adult-assisted opportunities to develop literacy in socially and personally meaningful ways. Missing from the studies, as good as they are, missing from the study is a framework, a larger framework that brings it all together. So they seem like isolated pieces of not even a puzzle. There's even a puzzle, right? They're just little pieces that we've identified that work towards the preservation of heritage languages and the development of language minority children. The framework of resilience, though, can help us bring all these pieces together and view it in a more coherent way, what's happening. So resilience theory can help us link seemingly unrelated or loosely connected phenomena that the research is giving us, is showing us. It also gives us new insight on the behavior of these language minority children, and it alerts us, most importantly, to the importance of developing resilience. And I'm going to go through each of these separately. First of all, as you can see, these areas of research in heritage language teaching connect directly to resilience. So it's not like critical language awareness is in one corner and biliteracy is in another corner. They're really they fall under the umbrella of conditions that allow for a positive adaptation to situations of adversity. So if we view them through the framework of resilience theory, we realize that they're all connected. As far as giving new insights into the behavior of heritage language students, I want to mention very briefly Lucy Che's 1998. She found the 4-stage model of ethnic identity development. She found that young children, when they're very young, they're still at home perhaps, or very early in the school years, they're not aware of who they are, that they speak another language, that they interact with people from another culture. They just are. When they enter school, it depends, it varies by individual, they enter a stage of ambivalence and evasion of the home culture. This is where they start to reject. You see the kind of behavior you associate with rejection of the home culture. Eventually, rather late most of the time, we see ethnic emergence happening late in the high school years or early in the college years. There's a process of identity exploration, and in some cases a shunning of dominant culture. It's kind of a part of the process. So this is when you start to see your students joining clubs, Latino clubs, speaking more Spanish. My students told me about it late in high school. For graduation, they wanted to put the Mexican flag up, and the principal said, no way, you're not going in there with the Mexican flag. They were at this stage, right? And number 4, the stage of identity incorporation. Not everybody reaches any one of these stages or moves through any one of these stages, but the final stage seems to be one of identity incorporation where they embrace a bicultural identity. Okay, so that's the theory. Let's look at what some of my students told me and what insights we can gain about those stages. This is a little long, but these narratives are so wonderful. I hope you don't mind my reading them. When I was 9, they gave us an English exam in school. I remember thinking it was strange because they only gave it to the Latino children. The test was so easy, it was silly, and even insulting stuff like draw a line, a circle. Then they asked me questions about my family. Remembering that my brother had told me that in school they didn't like people who spoke anything other than English, I told them that we spoke English at home. It was a lie that I didn't want to be in ESL anymore. I wanted to be with the rest of the students. My friend Susana's parents got angry at her because she said that her first language was Spanish and that she spoke Spanish at home. They put her in ESL because she needed help. Ever since then, there's a strategy of rejection. I never admitted that I spoke Spanish first. I felt bad, but that's what I had to do. Now, if we just look at this very superficially, it looks like an outright rejection of Spanish, right? But it's really not an outright rejection of Spanish. It's actually a very clever thing the student does. Number 1, the student has picked up on something that researchers know very well, and that is that the ESL track can be a little bit of a trap, and it is not the best way sometimes, as implemented in particular schools, may not be the best way to get ahead academically. The students figure that out, and they tell each other, hey, don't say anything about speaking Spanish, because they figured out the algorithm for placing students in ESL. They speak Spanish at home, they must go into ESL. Never mind how they speak English. But the students have figured it out. How smart is that? And notice then that he lies. It's a lie. He tells you it's a lie, right? So he's admitting that it's not that he's rejecting Spanish. He's covering up Spanish to reach a higher goal, which is to become proficient, academically proficient, and to improve his English. So notice how we shift. That shifts our perspective as to the rejection. To be sure, there are many cases of rejection, but maybe not all the cases that we're analyzing as rejection of Spanish and the home language are actual cases of rejection. Here's another interesting strategy. In first grade, 2 kids were speaking Spanish, making fun of another student. That student told the teacher, and she wasn't too happy. She told us how wrong it was to make fun of others, and implied that we shouldn't be speaking Spanish because we could be misinterpreted. Thereafter, whenever I spoke Spanish, I felt that others could think that I was talking badly about them. Even now, if I'm talking to a girlfriend in Spanish and a person who doesn't look Hispanic is around, I tend to switch to Spanglish. This way, I don't entirely leave Spanish, but I also leave no room for misinterpretations. How much do Spanish teachers hate Spanglish? How much does a monolingual world hate Spanglish, right? We see it as a bastard child of Spanish. It's actually a very clever strategy for staying in Spanish without creating social kinds of problems. Again, the use of Spanglish, as is depicted here, is not a rejection of Spanish. It is a way of navigating the difficulties associated with using Spanish in public. How clever is that? The last one is strategic silence. I work in a very busy emergency room, and sometimes I need to translate for patients. One patient I was working with was able to understand some of the questions the doctor posed to her in English. Was not able, maybe. When he realized this, he asked the patient if she understood him. Shyly, she said, yes, a little bit. The doctor then replied in a rude and angry tone, then you don't need to speak Spanish, do you? Unfortunately, they are the ones that sign my paycheck. And because this job is such a great experience, I can't make any complaints about the doctors until I get into medical school. Again, this looks like a rejection of Spanish. It really isn't. It's just a prioritizing of professional goals. The student is not defending this woman, is not stepping in to speak Spanish to this woman because he's thinking about his future. Interesting thing about this narrative, too, is that it shows us this person is now at the stage of identity incorporation, but even at this stage he's rejecting, apparently rejecting Spanish. It's not really a rejection, right? But this rejection that we associate with the second stage of acculturation is actually, it shows up throughout life, no matter what stage you're in, because sometimes you have no choice but to feign rejection, right? So this evasion of the home culture may not be an evasion so much as a postponement for social graces to get along in society. And some of the questions that these narratives raise about these stages are, why is the emergence of evasion or ambivalence associated with schooling? You think about it, why should it be? Why does it emerge at schooling? And I think, looking at these narratives, that it might have something to do with the fact that it's at the stage when they start schooling that children are powerless. They're little kids. That's the stage when they're being pushed around, for lack of a better expression. But they don't have much choice as to what to do. They're little kids. They're being told what to do. So that's the stage where they need to resort to these lies that they call, these evasions, this ambivalence, because they realize that they need that in order to move forward with their schooling. The flip question of that is, why does it diminish in the later years of adolescence, kind of around the at the end of K through 12, maybe the start of college? Well, think about it, because that's at the stage where now they're more independent. In college, though all that rejection, actually, it's not that it disappears, but it kind of mostly goes away. They're their own person, and they have more autonomy. So at that stage, it's safer to come out with Spanish. It's sort of like coming out of the closet. Yeah, this is what I am. Take me or leave me, right? At that stage, the stakes of coming out are not as high, right? And why does it not go away entirely, right? If you remember, this is associated, evasion and ambivalence is associated with stage 2. But we see it happening at stage 4. So why does it not go away entirely? Because the desire, the need to hide Spanish at some point or to camouflage it doesn't ever go away. There are situations, I think we all know, where you have to think strategically about how you're going to use Spanish. The final question I want to get to is, what can resilience theory contribute? Within these three is it can alert us to the importance of fostering the development of resilience in our students and probably in ourselves. I feel like I've tried to work on that myself. And we're very lucky because there's a vast body of literature on resilience. There are many studies of how to develop athletic resilience. If you think about it, athletes experience quite a bit of failure, and they have to be taught to bounce back, right? There's business resilience. I often think about those poor people that make the calls, that we find so annoying at dinner time. If it's annoying for us, I think it's probably really annoying for them to be told all the time, no, hang up, right? So I don't think that's the kind of resilience that these articles are talking about, but there's business resilience. So we can use this vast body of literature to think about how to develop resilience, protocols for developing resilience for our language minority students and our HL learners. And remember, I said I was going to come back to the notion of talent, supportive relationships with adults and teachers, and quality schools. This is the place where I come back with it. So I'm going to propose that we can really focus on those three areas and do a lot in the way of developing resilience. Let's talk about talent. Our students are incredibly talented. Arturo already told us about one thing at 6. Remember, he said, I guess at 6 I was already an interpreter, right? That's an amazing talent, right? Listen to what this student says. When the school nurse saw me pass by the office at my elementary school, she immediately stopped me and asked me for help. She told me she was waiting for the secretary to translate an emergency form that was written in Spanish. The nurse said she was frustrated, for she was constantly asking for help and not getting any. She gave me a form to translate. It was only 3 sentences. The nurse thanked me so much that it made me proud of who I am. I hadn't felt like my Spanish was useful, because I always speak it at home, but for some who knows nothing, it is a great help. I also felt good about myself and then it made me want to continue my Spanish skills to a more professional level. I have to go back. I realized I just skipped something. Remember, one of the things that makes some children particularly resilient is having a special talent. We see this a lot with poor children who are very musically talented. They can overcome poverty and rise out of poverty and move towards educational opportunities by virtue of their talent. And the idea that I want to develop is that if we look at these translation skills as these bicultural and bilingual schools as a talent in the same way that we conceive of musical skills, we can harness that to help our students become more resilient and be seen as more resourceful, right? So this is one example of that. This is another one. I remember a lady came into the doctor's office where I worked to prepare for an upcoming surgery. The lady was agreeing to everything, even though she didn't know what the doctor was telling. Finally, the doctor noticed she didn't understand, and she came to see if I knew Spanish, and I said I did. Later on, the doctor gave me a raise because he said it was good and that I helped, and he realized knowing different languages really helps out. So there again is the notion of these students have talent. Let's think of them as musically gifted. The same way that we think of musically gifted, when we get a musically gifted child, we want to give them every opportunity to develop those skills. We can think the same way of these very talent, the talent of being bicultural and bilingual. So the take-home message I want to leave you with about talent is teach to shine a light on, so here it is, and develop HL students' talents. Right? Treat students' knowledge of their HL and HC as a talent to be recognized and nurtured. And champion HL students in the school setting and the country and the society as valuable resources in their school. So don't say, oh, my students need help. Oh, yeah, your students need help. But your students are also darn talented. They are capable of doing incredible things. I'm talking about, maybe some of you are familiar with this book, Guadalupe Valdez's book, Expanding Definitions of Giftedness, the case of young interpreters from immigrant communities, where she argues that we need to expand what we consider giftedness, and that if you look at the skills of these young bilingual students, they fit within some kind of framework of giftedness. If we view Latino, first of all, it's true, but if we champion that view, we can take that and use it to build resilience. Now I'm going to move on to building supportive relationships with adults and teachers. And I took this from a wonderful novel. Maybe this isn't, I put it in my book, but it just comes from a wonderful novel I read by Victor Villaseñor. It's called Burro Genius. You can imagine from the title what it's about. He's a genius and a burro at the same time. But it's so beautiful, and I want to mention it. I was double, triple, quadruple shocked. I never had an A in all my life. My heart was beating a million times an hour. I remember all this like it had happened in a faraway, foggy dream. My God, I really hadn't realized it, but I owed so much of my joy of reading and writing to that substitute teacher in the 7th grade who in 3 tiny days had touched my heart and soul. He'd cut across the valleys of my deepest thoughts, giving light to the darkest crevices of my beaten down, inhibited mind, accessing a natural storytelling ability within me that was utterly profound. So as a child, he was constantly told he was stupid. He kept getting F's, and then one day that teacher leaves, and the substitute teacher comes in for 3 days. And those 3 days make all the difference in his life. He went on to write award-winning, beautiful award-winning books. This is a little long, but I want to go through these because these are so remarkable. And we can get, I want you to get a feeling from reading this one, what it can do, not just for the individual. Victor Villaseñor went on to become a writer, but what it can do for society. When I entered 1st grade, my teacher was an angel. I still remember her until this day. She would stay with me during recess, lunch, and sometimes after school in order for me to better my understanding of English. By 3rd grade, I was at the top of the class. I made a complete 180-degree turn. I learned the language very quickly and became a lover of reading. I read all day if I could. My 5th grade teacher gave me the novel The Great Gatsby as my graduation present, and to this day, it is my favorite novel of all time. I have had great relationships with most of my teachers, especially those who impacted my life as heavily as the ones in elementary and middle school. I went back, and this is where I want to focus on, I went back to tutor a class of 3rd graders one summer. I think it was 5 or 6 years later, after I had left the school, and some of the teachers still recognized me. I wanted to help those kids who were just like me, who had the desire to learn, but needed that extra push by someone who understood where they were coming from. I loved to teach the kids lessons that I thought one day I would become a teacher. So it's not that we can make great novelists. It's not that we can turn them into fantastic doctors. It's that they can go back and help other students do better and move ahead. And then for me, I have to say, this is the most remarkable of all stories in the book. A few years ago, my family took a road trip through Utah over the Christmas holidays. It seemed like this would be the perfect vacation spot for our family, but things did not turn out so well. An incident at a store will forever remain in my memory. My cousin and my little sister and I went to the corner store to buy some treats. We were speaking Spanish. While standing in line to pay, a man behind us sneezed, and I said to him, "Bless you." Much to my surprise, he gave the children and me a look of disgust. Not liking this, we decided to leave the store. As we reached the door, we heard the man say that Mexicans were dirty and that we should all go back to Mexico. This is a young person. This happened not very long ago. I resolved that I would be respectful to a fault and told him he should think about how his words would impact the children. When we got home, I explained to the children that this man was ignorant and said these things because he didn't know Mexicans. Adaptive distancing, right? I explained that even when people are disrespectful to us, we should be respectful to them. most of all, I made sure that the children understood that Mexicans are not dirty, but that we are respectful people. Isn't that an amazing story, right? This person, this young person, is acting as a mentor to her young cousins. And so the take-home message that I want you to take with regard to this is that we need to teach learners not just the language. Teach HL learners not just the language. And teaching learners involves developing a relationship with them as individuals, understanding their stories, and helping other adults, including teachers, community members, do the same. And we also need to see our students as wonderful mentors. This young woman did much better than I could have ever done. I would have probably screamed an obscenity at this man. She has such composure and such wisdom. She was able to model such grace for her young cousins. Moving on to quality schools, I'm going to go through this very quickly because time is soon going to be up. I'm not going to read this one, but this student mentions the importance of a summer bridge program as being so vitally important to opening up a new world for him and making it possible for him to access the resources that he needed in order to get to college. And I am going to read this one because this is a story by an undocumented child. And the first slide shows us a bad situation. The second slide shows us a good one, and the contrast is enormous. When I was in high school, I thought I was alone, that there was no one else like me. In my high school, there were no resources for undocumented children, and so I kept to myself, trying to make myself invisible. Afraid of being found out, I lived in fear, actually more like anxiety, especially at night. That kind of anxiety is paralyzing. You don't want to do anything because it can all disappear when you turn the corner. Let's turn the corner. Then I got to college and I discovered that there are many others like me and that there are resources for us. At my school, we have counselors who can steer us in the right direction and put us in touch with people who can help, like lawyers, employers, tutors. This has made a huge difference in my life. I don't know it all the time. I didn't know it all the time, but it turns out that there was a high school nearby with counselors for students like me. And so my advice is to have resources and make sure that the young people know about them. Children need to feel safe and to be part of a community. They need to be connected to others. So her high school is an example of what you don't want to do, what a bad school program is like, and the college is an example of what a good school looks like. So the take-home message about good schools, creating good schools, good environment for students to develop, is that HL teaching and learning is not just about language, it's also about the larger school experience and the overall well-being of Latino youth. And we, as heritage language teachers, as specialists in the area of Spanish and Latino culture, are natural stewards of Latino students in the larger school context and in society in general. And even more important for me, I can only speak for myself, is that my students are not problems to be solved by me. They are my go-to experts. I need to talk to them to understand the resources that they have and to make myself and others aware of these enormous resources that they bring to the learning process. Before I close, I want to give you a few thoughts about my trajectory of understanding as I work through this project. My understanding at the beginning of this project was that if I understood the research and I understood students as a member of a group, as labels, this group does this, at risk, this group is that, I was done. That was the main way for me to approach teaching these young people. Over the course of putting together this book, I had encounters with reality. I'm not reality, right? But I see is not reality. I came to talk to people. And I realized that I don't know half of what they go through. Half is a generous number. I probably don't know 90% of what they go through. And also that this view that they're all alike, even I fall prey to that view, that they're all alike, and the researchers can tell me what they're like, is flat out wrong. Let me tell you, I interviewed a number of siblings. In particular, I interviewed twins. And they gave me opposite answers. When I asked them, well, what should we do about Latinos? How can we help the school situation for them? They gave me opposite answers. Instead of dismissing it as statistical noise, as I started to talk to more and more of these students, siblings, I realized that, true, we need the lens of the research and of the labels, but we also need to see these students as individuals. We need to understand them with regard to specific personalities, background features, attitudes that they bring to the learning process. And that's where the story, the telling of stories becomes so important. So my trajectory is that I now balance the group view with the individual view. And I also view research as something that I do in my class, not something that comes from the outside with numbers by experts, but something that I do in my class when I ask them to tell me their life stories. So next steps, I think we need to do a little bit more studying of language maintenance and teaching through the framework of resilience theory. I think we need to work on developing resilience, heritage language and heritage culture resilience, by parlaying these things they can do into viewing them as real talents that merit investment, enormous investment on our part, by fostering better relationships with adults and by improving the quality of schooling. And I think we need to reach out to Latino youth and listen to their stories and learn from their wisdom. And with that, I'll end now. Thank you very much. Gracias, muchas gracias. Me voy a sentar.
Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias.
It has been a wonderful, powerful presentation.
Oh,
I think that we all here related to most or different facets, different things about when you were talking about. I'm so happy to see one of my students here too. And we're going to go and take a break and then come back with some comments and questions. I just have two things to say before, so we can have that in mind when we eat our wonderful sandwiches and coffee and pastry that we have outside. Is our role as teachers, the awareness. If we could, start this exercise of self-awareness. Why are we teachers? What are our goals? What are our prejudices, perspectives about these students and our profession? Because I work with Latino families, immigrant families with young children transitioning from home to school, I was able to see that back and forward of children, and I was really interested in what you were saying, how when they're young, they're just negotiating these two sets of cultural values, and it's so hard for them. Yeah. Some of them can really do it, this combination of resiliency, but I did a study about 4 children and Latino children, and you could see the variation. Those individual differences are so important to take into account. The child that was able to succeed academically, learning English and maintain Spanish, was the one who had the mother and the teacher that worked together the best and the most often. So that parent-teacher connection is crucial. Yeah. And in that regard, we can think about parents, we can have also an array of perspectives and expectations for the children, but we can start with us, right? Right. Thinking about what are we really doing here to those children? What if we do not promote that home language? What happens to them? And then I have been able to work with the end of the spectrum, the college students, and it's fascinating to see how the adults, we still are so important to them, because then they come together as a group. There's no home school culture to negotiate. They are inside negotiating, and now they come together as a group. So they recognize that there's so many of them, and they need the support of us also. So I think that I hope that we all can start thinking about that, the role that we have. in these wonderful lives. So with this, I just want to thank you again, and let's go for some coffee, and let's come back to have some conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.